Hello, listeners, and welcome to Higher Level History. I'm Professor Carthel. This podcast is a companion to the American Yawp online textbook, and the idea is simple. Each episode, we step behind the chapter to find the stories worth telling. We're going to slow down on the moments worth slowing down on, follow the people the textbook can only mention in passing, and ask the questions that make history feel less like a subject and more like a story. Let's get into it. Chapter 7 of the American Yawp is called A New Nation. It is, by any measure, the most crowded chapter you have read so far. The Constitutional Convention, the Bill of Rights, Hamilton's financial system, the Whiskey Rebellion, Jay's Treaty, the French Revolution, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the election of 1800, a decade of arguments about what kind of country this was supposed to be. Now, don't worry, we're not going to cover it all. Your reading of the chapter will do that. What I want to do today is take a closer look at one event in that decade. An event most students remember, if they remember it at all, as a series of footnotes. A whiskey tax, a few angry farmers, Washington put his uniform back on, the farmers run away, the end. But that's not what happened exactly. What happened was a test. And the way the new government chose to pass that test is one of the most important moments in early American governing. For most of the decade after the Revolution, the federal government could not tax its citizens. It couldn't raise revenue. It couldn't pay its debts. It could not enforce its own laws against people who didn't feel like obeying them. The Articles of Confederation, which had governed the country since 1781, were polite suggestions held together by goodwill. In 1788, however, the new Constitution changed that. The new federal government had teeth. It could levy taxes. It could regulate commerce. It could raise an army. And in 1791, the first president of the United States and his Secretary of the Treasury decided to find out whether the rest of the country had noticed. It was the fall of 1791. A man named Robert Johnson was riding through Washington County in the far western corner of Pennsylvania, where the Ohio Territory bled into the new republic. He was a federal tax collector. That title was new. A few months earlier, Congress had passed the first federal excise tax in the history of the United States. Now, if you're unsure of what an excise tax does, its primary purpose is to limit the consumption of a product by raising the price of that product through taxes. Today, we see this tax on things like tobacco products. This excise tax, however, applied to a long list of distilled goods. But the one that mattered, the one that landed on the people of Western Pennsylvania like a fist, was the whiskey tax. For farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains, whiskey was not a recreational beverage. Whiskey was money. Grain spoiled easily on the long wagon trip to the east. Whiskey did not. A man with a still could turn a wagon of corn into a barrel of liquor, and a barrel of liquor into hard cash. In the western counties, distillation was not a luxury. It was the difference between a paid debt and a foreclosed farm. On this day, however, when Robert Johnson came to collect, 16 men were waiting for him. They were dressed in women's clothes, long skirts, bonnets, faces blackened with soot. Tar and feather mobs had used this disguise for half a century. They knew the symbolism. They knew the precedent. They knew what was coming because they had seen their fathers do it to British stamp distributors in 1765. The men stripped Robert Johnson naked. They poured hot tar over his skin. They rolled him in feathers until he could barely move. And then they left him to die. He survived. The deputy marshals who came looking for the men who had done it did not fare any better. They were beaten, they were whipped, they were tarred and feathered themselves. They were left tied to trees with notes pinned to their bare chests. The federal government filed the report, and then the government did approximately nothing. For 2 years, tax collection in western Pennsylvania dwindled to almost nothing. Liberty poles went up in town squares. Local committees reformed under new names. The men who had run the resistance against British taxation in the 1770s knew exactly how to run a resistance against American taxation in the 1790s. The vocabulary was the same. The methods were the same. Even the disguises were the same. The rebellion that was building did not see itself as a rebellion. It saw itself as the inheritor of the values of 1776. In July of 1794, it stopped pretending. That month, armed farmers attacked federal marshals openly. They burned at least 2 tax collectors' homes to the ground, and at the end of the month, an attorney named David Bradford gathered an army of approximately 7,000 armed men 8 miles east of Pittsburgh. They robbed the United States mail to find out who in the region had been writing letters in support of the tax. They were prepared to march on Pittsburgh itself. This was the moment. George Washington was 62 years old. He had spent his entire adult life trying to figure out how an American government could survive its own people. He had watched Shays' rebellion threaten to tear Massachusetts apart in 1786. He had presided over the Constitutional Convention the next summer. He had taken the first presidential oath of office, knowing that everything he did in that office would set a standard for everything that came after. He did something that, in 1794, most observers in Europe did not believe was possible. He used the law. First, he sent commissioners. 3 distinguished Pennsylvanians rode west under presidential authority to meet with the rebels and offer them a peaceful resolution. They came with the offer of amnesty for any farmer willing to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States and to pay the tax going forward. While the commissioners rode west, Washington called up the militia. Not a few hundred men, but 13,000 men. He gathered them at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and on September 19th, he did something no sitting president has done before or since. He put on his old Continental Army uniform. He mounted his horse, and he rode out at the head of an army to enforce federal law. Then he stopped. After leading the army for the first stretch of the march, Washington turned command over to Henry Lee, the governor of Virginia and a hero of the Revolutionary War. Washington had made his point. The federal government would not be defied, but the federal government would also not be the kind of government that kept its own president at the head of a marching column for a single hour longer than necessary. When word reached the western counties that 13,000 federal troops were on the march, the rebellion melted. David Bradford fled to Spanish Louisiana. The 7,000 men who had gathered east of Pittsburgh went home. By the time the federal army arrived in the region in November, there was no rebellion left to put down. What there was instead was a question. What do you do with the men who started it? Federal officials oversaw the arrests. They oversaw the interrogations and the trials. Most of the men brought into federal custody were released for lack of evidence. Of those who were tried, 2 were convicted of treason against the United States. Treason carried the death penalty. 2 men, both farmers, sentenced to be hanged for taking up arms against a tax on whiskey, sat in federal custody waiting for what was supposed to come next. Death did not come. George Washington pardoned them both. He didn't pardon them quietly. He pardoned them publicly, on the record, in a written statement that became part of the official correspondence of the federal government. He had marched an army across Pennsylvania to prove that the government could enforce its laws. And then he had refused to take the lives of the men who had violated those laws, because mercy was also a power the federal government was supposed to have. Arrest trial, conviction, pardon. That was the whole sequence. From the first tarring of Robert Johnson in 1791 to the last pardon, the federal government did something no European observer expected it to do. It absorbed an armed uprising through the system of law. It did not crush the rebellion with a counter-rebellion. It did not execute the leaders to make an example. It used courts. It used juries. It used due process. And then it used grace through a presidential pardon. The men who tarred Robert Johnson had reached for the same weapon the Sons of Liberty had reached for a generation earlier. They had every reason to expect the same response. Crowds, mobs, burnings, and killings. It was the cycle that had run through American life for as long as anyone could remember. But they did not get violence. What they got instead was a government that took them to court. Six years before any of this happened, while the new Constitution was still sitting in front of state ratification conventions waiting to be approved or rejected, a man tried to explain why the federal government would need this kind of power. His name was Alexander Hamilton. He was 32 years old. He was writing under the pen name Publius, alongside James Madison and John Jay, in a series of newspaper essays that would eventually be collected as the Federalist Papers. Now, the essay we are about to read is Federalist Paper number 9. It was published in the Independent Journal on November 21st of 1787. It's one of the shorter pieces in the series. It's also one of the most direct. Hamilton titled it "The Union as a Safeguard Against Domestic Faction and Insurrection." He opens the essay with a single sentence. "A firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states, as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection." Think about that statement for a moment. In 1787, when Hamilton wrote those words, the United States had no standing army of any size worth mentioning. It had no federal tax collectors. It had no federal courts that could try a citizen for an act of rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was 4 years in the future. Shays' Rebellion was 13 months in the past, and it had nearly toppled the government of Massachusetts. Hamilton was not describing a problem that he had solved. He was describing a problem he expected to face. As he goes on, he writes about the ancient republics of Greece and Italy. He writes about what happened to them. And the language he uses is startling because it is the language of a man who has read his history and is genuinely afraid. It is impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated, and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. That is not the prose of a man writing about an abstraction. That is the writing of a man who believes that without a firm union, the United States is going to look like a Greek republic. Coups, counter-coups, mob rule giving way to tyranny forever. And then he says something that is, to my personal ear, the most important sentence in the entire essay. "The science of politics, however, like most other sciences, has received great improvement." The science of politics. Hamilton believed, the way an engineer believes in the strength of a bridge, that human beings had figured something out in the 18th century that early centuries had not. He listed what they had figured out: the separation of powers into distinct departments, legislative checks and balances, courts with judges holding their offices during good behavior, representatives elected by the people to act on the people's behalf. These, he writes, are wholly new discoveries. It is easy, 230 years later, to read those words as Hamilton congratulating himself. He wasn't. He was making a claim. The claim was that a republic, if it were carefully built, could absorb the kind of internal pressure that had destroyed every other republic in history. It could face down a faction, it could put down an insurrection, and it could do those things without becoming the kind of tyranny it had been built to prevent. In November of 1787, that was a theory. In November of 1794, when the Federal Army marched into western Pennsylvania and the rebellion melted in front of it, it was something a little more than a theory. When 2 convicted traitors walked out of federal custody alive, it became something else entirely. The system Hamilton had described in Federalist Paper No. 9 was capable of mercy, not because it was weak, but because it was strong enough to choose. That is the part of the early republic that most students never get a chance to sit with. The argument we are most familiar with is the argument about whether the federal government was too powerful or not powerful enough. Hamilton's argument was different. His argument was that the federal government had to be powerful, and the test of whether it was the right kind of powerful was whether it could afford to be lenient. In the spring of 1795, Washington wrote out the pardons. The science of politics, for one moment, held firm. When you read Chapter 7 of The American Yawp, you're going to move through enormous amounts of material in a relatively small number of pages. The chapter has to. There is too much happening in the 1790s to slow down on any one piece for very long. The Whiskey Rebellion is in there. The Yawp gives it about a paragraph and a half. When you get to that section, don't read it too quickly. Read it slowly. Notice the verbs. Notice who acts and who is acted upon. Notice the difference between what the federal government did first and what it did last. And as you read forward through the chapter, hold on to one question. What does it mean for a government to have power? Not just the power to act, but the power to choose not to. Chapter 7 of The American Yawp is available for free at americanyawp.com. Read it alongside this episode, not instead of it. I'm Professor Carthel, and this has been Higher Level History. That wraps up this episode of Higher Level History with Professor Carthel. Don't forget to check the episode description for full music and sound clip licensing information. If you have any questions or simply want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me at prof.carthel@higherlevelhistory.com. And if you haven't already, head over to theamericanyawp.com to access your free online copy of the American Yawp textbook. The podcast and the textbook work best together. Higher Level History is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with any academic institution. Until next time, I'm Professor Carthel.